Every year of the 1970s had its share of massive hits, but it also had its share of high-profile, expensive disasters that the industry quietly tried to move past. Here is the biggest music flop each year of the 70s. 1970, Self-Portrait by Bob Dylan.
Get you a copper kettle.
Bob Dylan released Self-Portrait in June 1970, and the critical response was one of the most brutal and sustained in the history of rock criticism. Greil Marcus opened his review in Rolling Stone with the line, "What is this shit?" A sentence that has been quoted in music writing for more than 50 years and still functions as a benchmark for critical directness. The album consisted largely of covers of other artists' material, live recordings from the Isle of Wight Festival of 1969, and a collection of originals that critics and longtime fans found bafflingly lightweight and uncommitted, coming from a songwriter who had produced some of the most celebrated and intellectually demanding music of the previous decade.
And all the people say there goes Tom Moore in the days of 49.
Dylan had been one of the most important figures in American popular music since the early 1960s. The writer of Blowin' in the Wind, Like a Rolling Stone, Mr. Tambourine Man, and a body of work that had permanently expanded what popular songwriting was understood to be capable of. The expectations attached to a new Dylan album in 1970 were correspondingly enormous and specific. Self-Portrait appeared to dismantle every one of them simultaneously across 2 full records. Critics who might have given a lesser artist the benefit of the doubt regarding an experimental or transitional release found no way to interpret what was being offered as anything but a significant and baffling failure. Whether Dylan was deliberately subverting the mythologized status that the music press had built around him, a theory that some critics have advanced in the decades since, or whether the album reflected genuine creative drift during a period of personal withdrawal, the effect on the public record was identical. Self-Portrait sold modestly but was treated as a commercial and artistic failure of significant proportions for an artist of his stature. Dylan followed it within 5 months with New Morning, a simpler and more accessible record that was received with audible relief by critics who had been trying to make sense of what had come before. But Self-Portrait remained the most notorious stumble in one of the most celebrated careers in the history of American popular music, a record that took decades to begin receiving even partial critical rehabilitation.
Get you a copper kettle.
1971, Ram by Paul McCartney.
We're so sorry, Uncle Albert.
Paul McCartney released Ram in May 1971, and critics attacked it with a consistency and contempt that established a narrative about his post-Beatles artistic standing that he spent much of the following decade attempting to escape. Reviewers found the album's pastoral, warm, melody-driven pop sensibility frivolous, whimsical, and disconnected from the cultural seriousness that the Beatles at their peak had come to represent. The production, handled by McCartney and his wife Linda McCartney, was characterized as domestic and lightweight, an album made in the countryside with animals, a happy family, and no apparent engagement with anything that mattered. John Lennon was publicly and specifically hostile toward Ram, interpreting certain of its lyrics as personal attacks directed at him and responding with pointed countermoves on the Imagine album later that year, a public exchange that music journalists followed with considerable interest.
We're so sorry, but we hadn't heard a thing.
Ram reached number 1 in the United Kingdom and number 2 in the United States. Commercial figures that tell you something essential about how completely commercial performance and critical reception can diverge. By the metrics that actually counted at the cash register, it was a genuine success. By the metrics that the rock press used to measure whether an artist had any serious claim on the culture's attention, it was treated as evidence that McCartney, without Lennon's abrasive intelligence, was capable of producing enormous charm without any accompanying substance. That the productive creative tension of the Beatles' partnership had been the mechanism responsible for keeping his melodic instincts grounded in material of genuine weight and consequence. That narrative attached itself to McCartney's public reputation firmly and remained attached for years, used by critics as the primary exhibit in an argument about his alleged artistic shallowness. Decades later, critics who returned to the album and musicians who cited it as an influence, most notably Brian Wilson, who named it as a significant touchstone, helped facilitate a full and substantial reassessment. But in 1971, Ram was the most mockingly reviewed release from one of the most famous musicians alive, and the damage done to McCartney's critical standing in that moment was real, specific, and long-lasting.
We're so sorry, Uncle Al.
1972, People Like Us by the Mamas and the Papas.
For people like us.
The Mamas and the Papas had been one of the most commercially successful and artistically distinctive vocal groups of the 1960s. Their close harmonies and sophisticated California pop sound producing a string of hits including California Dreamin', Monday Monday, and Dedicated to the One I Love that defined a particular sunlit, idealized version of the Los Angeles music scene. By the late 1960s, the group had dissolved under the weight of internal relationships that had become unsustainable, and each of its members, John Phillips, Michelle Phillips, Denny Doherty, and Cass Elliot, had pursued varying degrees of solo career with varying degrees of success. In 1971, the group reunited to record People Like Us for Dunhill Records, which had been their original label during the 1960s. The reunion was positioned as a genuine commercial comeback rather than a nostalgia exercise, with the label investing real promotional resources in the project. The album was released in October 1971, and its commercial failure became apparent through 1972 as it became clear the record had found almost no audience. Critics who reviewed it were indifferent at best. The material did not approach the quality of the group's best 1960s work, and the musical landscape of 1971 had moved so far from what had made the Mamas and Papas commercially significant that even a strong album might have struggled to find footing. People Like Us was not a strong album. Dunhill Records dropped the group following the release, closing the chapter on the commercial possibilities of the reunion definitively. The failure was particularly pointed because Cass Elliot, the most vocally distinctive member of the group, died in London in July 1974. Ensuring that People Like Us would stand permanently as the group's final commercial document, the last recording of a lineup that had once been at the absolute center of American pop culture, ending not with a bang, but with a release that nobody appeared to notice.
For people like us.
1973, Goat's Head Soup by the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones released Goat's Head Soup in August 1973, and while it reached number 1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom, and produced the hit single Angie, a ballad that became one of their most commercially successful non-rock singles, and remains one of the most recognized songs in their catalog, it was received by critics as a significant artistic regression from Exile on Main Street, which had been released the previous year and was rapidly being recognized as one of the greatest rock albums ever made. The critical consensus around Goat's Head Soup was that the Stones had produced a soft, unfocused, and at times listless album that recycled their established formulas without adding anything meaningfully new to the conversation, and that coming directly after the ambition, rawness, and dense musical richness of Exile, the retreat to a more polished and commercially comfortable sound was a disappointment that raised uncomfortable questions about whether the band's best creative work was already behind them. The more complete flop story of 1973 belongs to the band Chase, whose album Pure Music was released that year and found almost no commercial audience. Chase had been formed by Bill Chase, a trumpet player and bandleader whose technical virtuosity had been demonstrated on earlier jazz recordings, and the group's debut in 1971 had attracted attention with its jazz rock fusion approach. Pure Music represented an attempt to push further in a direction that radio and the commercial market were not prepared to follow, and it performed so poorly that the band's label showed no interest in continuing the relationship. Bill Chase died in a plane crash the following year, along with several band members, and the story of what Chase might have accomplished given more time and commercial support became one of the decade's more haunting, might-have-been narratives. Pure Music was the final document of a genuinely innovative musical project that ran out of commercial ground before it ran out of ideas. 1974, David Cassidy, The Higher They Climb.
When I'm rock and roll.
David Cassidy had been one of the most commercially powerful pop stars of the early 1970s, capable of generating scenes of fan hysteria at live performances that contemporary observers compared to Beatlemania at its most extreme. His fame had been built through his role as Keith Partridge on the Partridge Family television series, which ran from 1970 to 1974, and the pop singles that accompanied the show had sold in enormous quantities on both sides of the Atlantic. At his commercial peak, Cassidy was filling arenas in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia with an ease that established acts of far longer standing could not match. A 1974 concert at the White City Stadium in London attracted a crowd of 35,000 fans and resulted in a crush that left hundreds of people injured, an event that contributed to Cassidy's own decision to begin pulling back from the teen pop world that had made him famous. By 1974, Cassidy was attempting a transition that has challenged virtually every teen pop phenomenon in the history of popular music. The move from a young audience's idol to a credible adult rock artist capable of being taken seriously by critics and by listeners who had never been part of the teenage fan base. The album The Higher They Climb, recorded in 1974 and released the following year, was positioned as his artistic statement, an attempt to demonstrate that there was a serious musician beneath the manufactured pop image. Critics were not persuaded, and their skepticism was pointed. The album received poor reviews focused on the gap between the seriousness of Cassidy's apparent artistic intentions and the execution the record delivered, and its commercial performance was far below anything he had achieved during his Partridge Family years. The young audience that had purchased his records in enormous quantities had begun redirecting their attention toward other acts, and the adult rock audience he was trying to court showed no particular interest in acquiring him as an artist they could take seriously. The Higher They Climb represented the beginning of a protracted and often difficult decade-long search for a commercial identity that could sustain a career without the structural support of a television platform underneath it. 1975, Blow by Blow by Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck released Blow by Blow in March 1975, and it was an enormous critical and commercial success, one of the best-reviewed and best-selling instrumental rock albums in the history of the genre. The genuine documented flop of 1975 was the commercial underperformance of John Lennon's rock and roll album, released in February of that year, which had arrived after a recording process so turbulent and legally complicated that by the time the record reached the public, the story surrounding its making had largely overtaken the music itself in the public conversation. Lennon had originally attempted to record the album in late 1973 with Phil Spector producing at the record plant in Los Angeles. The sessions had been chaotic and ultimately became unusable as Spector's behavior in the studio deteriorated, and eventually the tapes were held for months in a dispute that required legal resolution before Lennon could regain access to the material he had recorded. Additional complications arose when Morris Levy of Roulette Records, who had been involved in a separate legal settlement with Lennon over copyright issues, produced and briefly distributed an unauthorized version of songs from the sessions through a television mail order scheme before the official release was available. By the time Capitol Records released the completed and authorized version in February 1975, the album carried a weight of backstory that made receiving it as a simple collection of rock and roll covers almost impossible. The music itself, Lennon's interpretations of 1950s and early 1960s rock and roll songs that had influenced him in his youth, was received as pleasant but inessential, a nostalgic exercise that did not add meaningfully to his existing body of work and that critics characterized as an obligation discharged rather than a creative achievement willingly offered. Shortly after the album's release, Lennon entered a period of complete public and professional withdrawal that lasted until the release of Double Fantasy in 1980, making rock and roll the final commercial statement of a significant chapter in his solo career, ending that chapter on a distinctly quieter note than the one it had opened on. 1976, Spiders from Mars by Mick Ronson. Mick Ronson had been one of the most important guitar voices in early to mid-1970s, rock through his foundational work as lead guitarist of David Bowie's Spiders from Mars lineup, contributing the arrangements and playing that defined some of the most celebrated recordings of the glam rock era. Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars in 1972 and Aladdin Sane in 1973 had both depended heavily on Ronson's ability to translate Bowie's musical ideas into something that could be realized and performed. When Bowie dissolved the Spiders in 1973, Ronson was left to pursue a solo career that generated genuine critical goodwill based on the quality of what he had contributed to Bowie's work, but that goodwill did not translate into commercial traction. His debut solo album, Slaughter on 10th Avenue in 1974, had received respectful reviews without finding a substantial audience. His 1975 follow-up, Play Don't Worry, found even fewer listeners. By 1976, his attempt to establish himself as a headlining solo act had effectively stalled, and the commercial recognition that might have been expected as a reward for years of foundational studio and live work simply did not arrive. The more broadly documented flop story of 1976 belongs to the spectacular commercial and critical failure of Rick Wakeman's The Myths and Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which had been released and toured in 1975 and whose financial aftermath was being reckoned with through 1976. The production had involved ice skating performers portraying the characters of the Arthurian legend, a full classical orchestra, a choir, and a staging at Wembley Empire Pool that was designed to be simultaneously a concert, a theatrical event, and a rock performance. The production costs were enormous and substantially exceeded the revenue the project generated from ticket sales and album purchases. Critical responses ranged from genuine admiration for the sheer ambition of the undertaking to pointed mockery of what some reviewers described as the most extravagant example of 1970s progressive rock excess yet attempted. Wakeman's relationship with his label suffered as a consequence, and the financial fallout of the King Arthur production contributed to a significant and necessary scaling back of his commercial ambitions in the years that followed. 1977, the Joni Mitchell and Charles Mingus Project.
Had a porky pig hat on.
In 1977, jazz composer and bandleader Charles Mingus approached Joni Mitchell about a creative collaboration before his health had declined, to the point that composition and recording had become impossible. Mingus was already suffering from the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis that would take his life in January 1979, and the project he proposed, setting 6 of his melodic compositions to new lyrics written by Mitchell, was both a genuine creative challenge and a final artistic statement he needed to make before he lost the ability to make it. Mitchell accepted and began the work during a period when her own musical direction had already moved well away from the folk and soft rock sound that had originally built her audience, through a series of increasingly jazz-influenced albums that had divided critics and commercial expectations alike.
A bright star in a dark age.
The resulting album, Mingus, was released in June 1979, 5 months after Mingus died. Its commercial reception was one of the most discussed and documented failures of Mitchell's career. Her existing audience, which had followed her through Court and Spark in 1974, The Hissing of Summer Lawns in 1975, and Hejira in 1976, found the austere and demanding setting of Mingus too far removed from the melodic accessibility and personal intimacy that had drawn them to her work in the first place. Jazz purists, on the other hand, were uncertain about the appropriateness of a pop artist working with Mingus's legacy at all. The album sold poorly by the standards of Mitchell's earlier releases and generated confused reviews that acknowledged the ambition of the project without finding adequate language to evaluate it within any existing critical framework. Mitchell has said in interviews across the subsequent decades that she considered Mingus her most challenging and, in some respects, most important creative achievement, a project that stretched her beyond the boundaries of what she had previously attempted. Critical reassessment has been considerably more generous than the original 1979 reception allowed, but in commercial terms, Mingus represented a significant setback that marked a clear turning point in the arc of her mainstream career.
Had a porky pig hat on.
1978, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the film. The 1978 film adaptation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was one of the most spectacularly documented commercial and critical disasters in the history of popular music. The film was produced by Robert Stigwood and directed by Michael Schultz, and it starred Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees, two of the most commercially powerful acts in the world at that precise moment, in a storyline adapted from the conceptual framework of the Beatles' 1967 album. The cast also included an enormous assemblage of popular music artists making cameo appearances, including Aerosmith, Alice Cooper, Earth, Wind and Fire, Steve Martin, and George Burns, among many others. The film cost approximately $13 million to produce and was released with a massive promotional campaign backed by RSO Records, which had been riding an extraordinary commercial wave following the success of the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack the previous year. The critical response upon release was devastating across the board. Reviewers described the film as a confused, expensive, and tonally inconsistent disaster that managed to make even some of the most beloved songs in the history of popular music feel empty and joyless. The box office performance was poor relative to the scale of the investment. For Peter Frampton specifically, the Sgt. Pepper's film was a commercial and reputational blow that interrupted a momentum that had been building towards something extraordinary since Frampton Comes Alive in 1976. His next album, Where I Should Be, released in 1979, performed significantly below the heights he had reached 2 years earlier, and the recovery from the Sgt. Pepper's experience took years. The Bee Gees were commercially resilient enough to absorb the film's failure without comparable long-term damage, though the Sgt. Pepper's project contributed to the growing cultural backlash against the disco era and the commercial excess associated with it that would gather considerable force through the end of the decade. The entire production is remembered in the music industry as a cautionary example of what happens when commercial ambition, contractual obligation, and the assumption that two massively popular acts can carry any project simply by being in it override the more basic question of whether the underlying creative idea is sound enough to justify the investment. 1979, Knebworth Concert, various artists. The Knebworth Festival of August 1979 was one of the most ambitious live music events ever attempted in the United Kingdom, drawing an estimated audience of between 250,000 and 400,000 people to the grounds of Knebworth House in Hertfordshire over 2 concert dates on August 4th and August 11th. The event featured Led Zeppelin headlining their only UK concerts of 1979 and what would prove to be their final UK concerts ever, alongside performances by Todd Rundgren's Utopia, The New Barbarians featuring Keith Richards and Ron Wood, Chaz and Dave, Southside Johnny and the Asbury Jukes, and the British rock group Commander Cody. Led Zeppelin's performances were recorded over both nights for what was intended to become a major live concert film and studio-quality album release that would serve as a definitive document of the band at the height of their live powers. Neither the film nor the album ever materialized in the form the band had intended. Led Zeppelin disbanded in September 1980 following the death of drummer John Bonham, who died at Jimmy Page's home after consuming an extraordinary quantity of vodka over the preceding hours. The decision to dissolve the band rather than continue without Bonham was made quickly and communicated publicly within weeks of his death. The commercial follow-through on what had been positioned as the band's major live statement, the demonstration that they remained one of the most powerful performing acts in rock, despite years of reduced live activity, simply did not happen. The recordings from Knebworth were not officially released in any comprehensive form until decades later, as part of archival reissue programs that arrived long after the cultural moment had passed. The largest concert event of 1979 in the United Kingdom, attended by hundreds of thousands of people and staged at enormous expense, produced no lasting commercial product in the window when it could have had meaningful commercial impact. The Knebworth shows stand as one of the decade's strangest and most poignant commercial non-events, a massive spectacle attended by more people than almost any other event in the history of British popular music, mounted at enormous expense and documented on tape over 2 nights, yet producing no lasting commercial product in the window when it could have had meaningful cultural and commercial impact. The recordings finally emerged in official releases decades after the concert, reaching an audience that had spent years aware that something extraordinary had been captured at Knebworth without ever having access to it through commercial channels. As a summation of what the 1970s could produce at its most ambitious and its most bittersweet, enormous scale, genuine greatness, and the failure of any of it to translate into the lasting commercial product it was designed to become. The 1979 Knebworth Festival is as complete an ending as any decade in popular music has ever managed to arrange for itself. Every year of the 1970s had its share of overreach, miscalculation, and genuine disaster, operating right alongside the hits that people still carry with them today. The music industry of that decade moved fast, spent enormous money, and made spectacular mistakes with the same energy and scale that it made its greatest records. If any of these stories brought back a memory or reminded you of something you had forgotten was even part of that decade, you were paying close attention during one of the most interesting and unpredictable periods in the history of popular music. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more where this came from.